there is a version of you that has been very loyal to struggle. Welcome to Quantum Wealth Lab. Not because it wanted to suffer, but because that identity became the story that made you feel real, worthy, grounded in something honest, the one who works hard for everything, the one who never had it easy, the one who knows what things actually cost because they have paid the full price for every single one of them. That identity is not an accident. In many cases, it was forged in genuinely difficult circumstances, and the depth of character it produced is real. The resilience, the ability to function under pressure, the particular quality of empathy that comes from having known what it is to struggle in a way that people who have not known it cannot fully access. But identity has a cost when it becomes a cage. And the struggling identity, the one that equates hardship with authenticity, that makes financial ease feel somehow suspicious, that generates a quiet guilt or a sense of unreality when things go well for too long. That identity becomes a cage when it starts limiting the life you are able to build. You have outgrown it, not necessarily in every domain of your life, but in your relationship with money, with financial expansion, with the version of yourself that is capable of building something genuinely substantial without the subconscious system generating a correction. This session releases the identity that is no longer needed, not by condemning it, by completing it, honoring the work it did and the person it made, and then allowing it to step aside for the version that was always waiting behind it. I release the struggling self with love. 4 words that carry more weight than they appear. With love, not with dismissal. Not with the contempt of someone who has finally escaped something they never wanted. With the genuine love of someone who recognizes what the struggling identity made possible and chooses, from that place of recognition, to let it complete. The struggling identity was not a malfunction. It was a construction, assembled over years, from the raw material of difficult circumstances and the decisions you made in response to them. It gave you things you needed. The ability to keep going when the outcome was uncertain, the skill of doing more with less, the particular integrity that comes from knowing you did not take shortcuts, the community of people who recognized themselves in your story. Those things do not dissolve when the identity releases. They are yours, integrated into who you are in ways that do not depend on continuing to struggle to maintain them. What releases is the limitation. The part of the struggling identity that says, this is who you are, which means this is how much you can have, which means this is the ceiling on what is appropriate for someone with your story. That part, the part that conflates the experience with the limit, that is what you are releasing. You keep the resilience, you keep the empathy, you keep the hard-won wisdom. You release the ceiling that came with it. I release the struggling self with love. It served. It is complete. Feel the space after the old identity falls. Not the dramatic space of a collapse, the quiet, clarifying space that opens when something you have been carrying for a long time is finally set down. The way a room feels after furniture that was never quite right has been removed. Larger, more honest, more genuinely yours. In that space, in the space after the struggling identity has stepped aside, what becomes available? The willingness to receive abundance without qualifying it with a reminder of how hard it was to get there. The capacity to feel financial ease without the subconscious system generating the correction that restores the familiar difficulty. The freedom to build toward something significant without the identity ceiling that says, not quite this much, not quite this kind of person. Feel into a specific version of financial abundance that the struggling identity has been quietly vetoing. Not a fantasy, a real, achievable version of your financial life that is slightly larger, slightly more comfortable, slightly more stable than the struggling identity's permitted maximum. In the space after the release, that version is no longer vetoed. It is simply the next step. The natural continuation of a life that has been building toward it, finally freed from the internal architecture that was keeping it just out of reach. The space is open, The abundance that fills it is not foreign, it is simply yours, arriving into a space that has finally been cleared to receive it. The dissolve is a deliberate act, not a passive one. Here is the practice for this block. Close your eyes if you have not already. Bring to mind the struggling identity, not as an abstraction, but as a felt sense, the weight of it, the specific quality of how it sits in the body, the posture it takes, the way it moves through financial conversations, through decisions about money, through moments when things go well and it generates the familiar qualification. Hold it clearly, not with resentment, with recognition. This is the thing that kept you grounded when grounding was what you needed. This is the identity that made you real to yourself during years when reality was complicated. And now, with full acknowledgement of what it gave you, say, quietly to the identity itself, as if it is a part of you that can hear the following. Thank you, you did your work. You kept me honest and grounded and real in the ways I needed to be. I carry everything valuable that you built, and now I am choosing something larger. Not because you were wrong, because I have grown past the circumstances that required you. You are complete, I am releasing you. And then, deliberately, consciously, step forward. Not dramatically, simply step. Leave the struggling identity in the place where you were standing and feel who you are in the step ahead of it. That is the dissolve. For the struggling self that carried you here. This gratitude is the most important part of the session, because without it, the release is not a completion, it is a rejection. And the subconscious does not respond well to rejecting parts of itself. It responds to integration, the recognition that what is being released was real and valuable and had a proper function, and that its release is an honoring, not a discarding. What did the struggling self give you? Be specific. Name the actual things it produced, not in spite of the difficulty, but through it. The quality of relationships built in hard circumstances. The skills developed under pressure that would not have been developed any other way. The specific kind of confidence that comes from knowing you have handled things that were genuinely difficult and you are still here. The struggling self made you the person who is capable of sitting in this session and choosing to release it, which is itself a significant act, one that most people never make, because the struggling identity has convinced them that it is all they are. You know differently. You know it is something you have, not something you are. And that distinction, that ability to hold the identity at a slight distance and choose differently, that is a capacity the struggling self, through all its difficulty, helped you develop. Thank you for the character. Thank you for the resilience. Thank you for the wisdom that only difficulty gives. You are not forgot, you are completed. Rebirth is your right. Not a privilege earned through sufficient suffering. Not a reward issued to people who struggled long enough to deserve a different life. A right inherent in the nature of identity itself, which is not fixed but dynamic, not permanent but constantly in the process of being chosen. The struggling identity was not the final form. It was a form, an adaptive response to specific conditions, which served its purpose and which can, when those conditions have changed, be replaced by a form better suited to the new conditions. You are allowed to be a different person than the one who went through the difficult things. Not a person who pretends the difficult things did not happen. A person who has genuinely integrated them, genuinely moved through them, genuinely arrived at a place where the identity they installed is no longer the most accurate or useful description of who you are. The new identity is not a performance. It is not you pretending to be someone you are not. It is the more accurate version, the one that reflects what you have actually become, which is someone who has been through the difficulty and chosen, with full awareness, to build something different. You are not performing expansion. You are choosing it, with your full history intact. With the complete record of what you have been through available as evidence of your capacity, not as a ceiling on your arrival. Rebirth is simply the next accurate description of who you are. Step into the new self. Not gradually. Now. In this moment, in this session, step into the version of you that is no longer defined by the struggling identity. The one that exists on the other side of the release, not as a stranger, but as a recognition. As the version that was always there, behind the weight of the identity that had been doing the limiting work. This self carries everything the struggling identity built. The resilience is still present. The empathy is still present. The particular groundedness that comes from having navigated genuine difficulty is still present. None of that dissolves with the release. What is different is the ceiling. This self does not have one in the same place. The subconscious reference point for how much financial life is appropriate has been recalibrated, not to a number, but to an orientation. The orientation of someone who is building, not managing. Creating, not surviving. Receiving, not rationing. This self moves through financial decisions with the particular ease of someone who does not have a background system running the struggling identity's calculations. No quiet computation of whether this is too much. No reflexive qualification of good news. No guilt around financial ease that is, for the first time, simply ease, not a problem to be solved or a reality to be distrusted. You are already this self. The session has already moved the needle. The recognition of the new identity is the arrival. Step in, it fits. Integrate the dissolve. You came in carrying an identity that was doing double duty, protecting you from the vulnerability of full expansion while simultaneously limiting how far the expansion could go. You are leaving with that identity completed, honored, acknowledged, and consciously released. What remains is the person who was always underneath it, the one the struggling identity was, in its own way, protecting. That person is not fragile. They are, if anything, more grounded than the struggling identity allowed, because the grounding now comes from choice rather than from circumstance. From the conscious decision to inhabit this version of yourself, rather than from the default installation of a version you never fully agreed to. The integration that follows this session is not dramatic. It is the quiet daily practice of noticing when the struggling identity tries to reassert itself. And it will, because neural patterns established over years do not dissolve in one session, and choosing the new identity in response. Not with effort. With the calm of someone who has already made the decision and is simply implementing it. The dissolve is complete. The new self is installed. The ceiling that came with the old identity has been released, along with the guilt, the qualification, and the particular weariness of someone who confused difficulty with authenticity for longer than was necessary. You are not the struggling self anymore. You are what comes after, and what comes after is significantly better. Until next time, keep expanding. One practice to carry forward from this session. When the struggling identity reasserts, when you notice the familiar guilt around financial ease, or the qualification of good news, or the subconscious calculation of whether this is too much for someone with your story, do not argue with it. Do not try to logic it away. Simply say to yourself and to the part of you that is running the old program, I see you. You are not needed here. I am the new self now. And then take one action that the struggling identity would have hedged or avoided, something small enough to be practical, but large enough to be real. A decision made from the new identity rather than the old one. A step the new self takes that the struggling self would have qualified into non-movement. That action is the integration. Every time you take it, the new self becomes more real and the struggling identity becomes more historical. And when you have taken that step this week, when you have caught the struggling identity mid-reassertion and chosen the new self instead, come back to the comments. The community question this week is, what is one thing the struggling identity has been keeping you from doing, and what would the new self do instead? Subscribe. Share this with someone who has been loyal to a struggling identity that has done its work. Until next time, keep expanding.